On this video, we like to look at cofunction identities. So we have 6 identities, but I want you to notice the relationship between sine theta and cosine theta, tangent theta and cotangent theta, secant theta and cosecant theta. So for example, it says sine theta is cosine theta of pi over 2 minus theta. And cosine theta is sine of pi over 2 minus theta. So for example, if you have sine of pi over 3, what is theta? Theta is pi over 3. So that's going to be the same thing as cosine of pi over 2 minus, what is a theta? Well, theta is pi over 3. Are they really equivalent? Well, let's check. What is sine of pi over 3? Sine of pi over 3 is radical 3 over 2. What about cosine of this? Well, if you simplify it using common denominator, you are going to get pi over 6. Since pi over 2 minus pi over 3 is 3 pi over 6 minus 2 pi over 6, which is pi over 6. Now, what is cosine of pi over 6? Well, that's radical 3 over 2. So indeed, these two are equivalent. You could apply those similar concepts to all the rest of the identities. Remember, the sine theta and cosine theta are related. Tangent theta, cotangent theta, and secant theta and cosecant theta. And these are the cofunction identities. On this video, we're going to talk about odd and even identities. Before I get in, let's review about odd and even functions. Let's say you have f of x equals x squared. What do you notice when you put f of negative 2? Well, that's going to be quantity negative 2 squared, which is 4. What about f of positive 2? Well, that's going to be still positive 4. Have you noticed that you got the same result, whether you put negative 2 or positive 2? That's what even function will do. Instead of x, even though you put negative x, it will still be f of x, which is x squared. That's the property of even function, when f of negative x equals f of x, meaning that it doesn't matter whether you put negative 2 or negative 3. If you put negative 3, it will be the same thing as putting in f of, for example, f of negative 3 will still be equal to f of 3. That's what happens to even functions. What about odd functions? Now let's take a look at f of x equals x cubed. What is f of 2? F of 2 is 2 to the third, which is 8. What is f of negative 2? That's going to be quantity negative 2 to the third, which is negative 8. What happens to the y value? Well, they're opposites. So odd function is when you have f of negative x, it turns out to be negative of f of x. When this happens, we call that function is odd. So when you put negative x, 2 for x cubed, you're getting negative x cubed. And what was our f of x? F of x was x cubed. What is f of negative x? It's negative x cubed. So that's why f of x equals x cubed is odd function. So let's look at the 3 identities here. Which one is odd and which one is even? Let's take a look at first one. Sine of negative theta equals negative sine theta. Well, that's going to be odd because when you put negative theta, notice it became negative sine theta. What about cosecant of negative theta? That becomes negative cosecant theta. so it's odd. What about cosine of negative theta? Well, that just becomes cosine of theta, so this will be even. What about secant of negative theta? That equals to secant theta, so this is even. What about these two? As you can see, this is odd, and that's also odd. So for example, when you have sine of negative pi over 6, according to the identity, it's going to be negative. What is theta here? Theta is pi over 6. So it's going to be negative sine of pi over 6. Is it? What's sine of pi over 6? Well, that's 1/2, so you have negative 1 over 2. What is sine of negative pi over 6? That's going to be negative 1 over 2 using the triangle and reference angle. So these are odd and even identities. Let's take a look at some examples of cofunction and odd and even. So basically, they're giving us tangent theta equals 1.28, and we need to find cotangent of quantity theta minus pi over 2. Well, you know that tangent theta is a cofunction of cotangent, meaning that tangent theta is equal to cotangent of pi over 2 minus theta. However, notice this says cotangent of quantity theta minus pi over 2. So what if we switch this around? We could do that by taking out the negative. When you take out the negative, this will be theta minus pi over 2. Let's take a look at it. What's negative times theta? Well, that's negative theta. What's negative times negative pi over 2? That's pi over 2. Basically, these two are the still same thing. Let's go back to algebra 1. When you have x minus y, that is the same thing as when you take out the negative, it will be quantity y minus x. Now, remember, cotangent, was it even or odd? If you have a cotangent of negative alpha, what is that? Well, that's negative cotangent of alpha because cotangent is odd. So we could take out this negative, you get negative cotangent of quantity theta minus pi over 2. Now, let me put down tangent theta here. Let's multiply both sides by negative. So you get negative tangent theta is cotangent of quantity theta minus pi over 2. Now this is what we're looking for, cotangent of theta minus pi over 2. What is cotangent of theta minus pi over 2? That's negative tangent theta. And what is our tangent theta? Well, they said it's 1.28. So what is the answer? And the answer will be negative 1.28. Let's take a look at another example. If sine theta is negative 0.37, it says find cosine of quantity theta minus pi over 2. Well, you know that sine and cosine are cofunctions, meaning that sine theta is cosine of quantity pi over 2 minus theta. Notice we're looking for cosine of quantity theta minus pi over 2. We need to somehow interchange the location of these two. So again, we got to take the negative out. It will be theta minus pi over 2. Watch. Negative times theta is negative theta. Negative times negative pi over 2 is positive pi over 2. So these two are equivalent. Now, remember, is cosine of negative alpha will be, since cosine is even, cosine of negative alpha is cosine of alpha. So this cosine of negative quantity theta minus pi over 2 will be cosine of theta minus pi over 2. Now, this is what we're looking for. What is sine theta? Sine theta is negative 0.37. Therefore, the answer is negative 0.37.